And I'd like to first start by, condemning the Russian aggression. It is not a war, it is more of an aggression by Russia against an independent country. And it has breached all principles of international law, whether it's territorial integrity, the UN Charter, there is talk of human rights violation, sovereignty, all of that. But that said, let's just very quickly look at the origins of the crisis. Professor Patnaik is here, so he'll probably give you a more detailed explanation of what Russia is thinking. I'm so sorry. I need to put my phone on silent. Sorry. So to look at the origins of the crisis, I think most of us who are following the media, it's quite clear that this is not something which happened over last October or something. In 2000, Putin had said, NATO is not a threat to Russia, and he had even said at that point that Russia would even consider joining NATO if the circumstances are right. And so you had the NATO-Russia Council being formed, but then despite the overtures that Putin made, the alliance kept expanding, right, all the way to Russia's border. So from Putin's attempts at a rapprochement with NATO to now, what has happened? One is, of course, that clearly the blame for the crisis is not just Russia; it is also the West, and it is also Ukraine to a lesser extent. The West has been really leading up Ukraine up the garden path, forcing them to take certain very stubborn positions. Similarly, the Russians have also been very, very stubborn. But like I said, Russia has had this very long festering demand that NATO should not be on its borders. It believes in this whole idea of spheres of influence. So it believes that if NATO becomes part of, if Ukraine becomes part of NATO, it will want to take Crimea away by force, and that becomes a direct NATO-Russia confrontation. And then, of course, there is a lot of distrust with the West, because, you had James Baker promising to Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch towards the east. Of course, Russia was in no position then, of course, but even then there was this verbal assurance which was given that NATO would not expand. But then you had the expansion of NATO in 2004 and 2007, and with Latvia and Estonia in the NATO, obviously they're both on the borders of Russia. But today, the Russia to whom James Baker made that promise and then went back on that promise has changed. We have a stronger Russia now. It has a lot of reserves. It has come back in Syria. So it has also been emboldened by the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and by Chinese, but its own relationship, its own very strong partnership with the Chinese, as well as the fact that it was actually able to play a very important role in the Syrian crisis. And then, of course, to come to Russia's security concerns, some of them, of course, you look at the psyche of the country. Russia has always been attacked from Europe, and it's always seen expansionism as kind of defense. We talk about defensive aggressiveness, which Stephen Kotkin talks about. And then there is also this cultural part, the identity politics of this all. Both Russia and Ukraine, they claim heritage from Rus or Kievan Rus, which is where the Slavic tribes, united under the Byzantine Church in the 10th century. And then, of course, they were driven out by the Mongols. But then Kiev was proclaimed as the mother of Rus. And, of course, after they were driven out by the Mongols, the Russians moved towards, the Moscow direction and formed the Russian state. And then, of course, there is also this idea of this cultural affinity. All Ukrainians and Russians have relatives here and there. Crimea is where Saint Vladimir converted the Slavs to Christianity. And then, of course, you have Russia always being insecure because of Europe, but also wanting to be accepted as a European country. You look at the Russian symbol, it's a double-headed Europe eagle. One side it looks towards Asia, the other side looks towards Europe. But the Russian elites have always seen themselves as Europeans, even though 70-75% of the territory is in Asia. So they've not been accepted as Europe. So that is also one reason that, for part of this confrontation, I think, is because Russia has never been accepted as an equal by the West. Then, of course, to come to the confrontation, the West, of course, says that Ukraine is a sovereign country. It has the right to choose any alliance if it wants to join, which is true. I mean, which is what international politics is all about. But then, obviously, Russia's insecurity and Ukraine's right as to choose any alliance it wants to join would not go together. And that's where the confrontation is coming from. To come to Putin's aims, during the Euromaidan protests, I think what we're seeing on Western media is a whitewash. The Euromaidan protests were something in which the Americans were significantly entrenched in it. You had US embassy officials distributing sandwiches to the protesters in the Euromaidan protests. So obviously the Americans were very, very deeply involved in it. There were some Ukrainian ultranationalists who were part of it. So Putin saw it as an attempt to change the regime to a pro-European one. And then, of course, after the Euromaidan protests, after the fall of the regime, you have Russian being removed as a second language, ethnic Russians being targeted, and then this whole problem between the Catholics and the Russian Orthodox Church. Last year Zelensky proclaimed a whole new Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and Russia sees
You're not audible, Madam. Yeah.
Not audible.
Now you can.
Now.
Should I come closer? No. Yeah, so I'm saying that ethnic Russians were targeted after the fall of the regime in 2014. And then Russia sees itself as a protector of the Orthodox Church, but Zelensky last year proclaimed a new Ukrainian Orthodox Church, right? And then, of course, the Western media says Putin wants to bring back the Soviet Union. But if you look at Putin's speech, he talks about bringing back the Tsarist Empire. He's very, very critical of the communists, actually, right? So I think being a realist person, I don't think Putin is really interested in bringing back the Soviet Union. It's not a realistic objective to have. And then, of course, the final is that he wants to protect the Black Sea fleet of the United States, of Russia. Sorry. Ukraine also, of course, has its own grievances. And obviously, it is an independent country which can take decisions. It is going back in history, talking about Stalin's famines, where 7.5 million people died. It is rightfully upset with the annexation of Crimea, even though it is 90% Russian. And then, of course, Putin's recognition of the Donbas Republic, the Lugansk and the Donetsk republics are against its territorial integrity. And then Ukraine has also not followed through, neither have the Russians followed through on the Minsk agreements, because there is this confusion about which part of the agreement has to be brought up. To look at the role of the West, I mean, I think NATO, I don't understand why NATO still exists, despite the fall of the Soviet Union. It was meant to contain communism. There is no more communism. But it is there, okay, let's accept the reality. But the point is, even while they are arming the Ukrainians, even while they are sanctioning the Russians, they are not willing to intervene, right? They're giving military advisors, they're giving aid, they're giving equipment, but they do not want a direct confrontation. Right? And this is probably because, on one hand, the US does not want, a Europe which is dependent on Russia, particularly Germany, and Russia being an interdependence is something which the US would see as a challenge. But the point I'm trying to make is, despite egging on the Ukrainians, the NATO is not willing, neither is the US willing to actually put their own troops on the ground. I mean, they do not want to come back with body bags and explain to their people why someone has died in Ukraine fighting for democracy, quote unquote. How is the battle? How is the war going so far? I think that Putin has clearly lost the battle of perceptions. If you look at 1968, Czechoslovakia folded up in 2 days, right? But this is this huge country attacking the second largest country in Europe, of course. But even then, the progress has been pretty slow. But to be fair to the Russians so far, I mean, they have not carried out airstrikes. I think they have started, I think, to the airstrikes. There's been no carpet bombing like the US did in Iraq. So the number of casualties is not as big as US in Iraq. But the longer this war goes on, I think the greater the chances of escalation, because Putin will have to otherwise explain to the mothers in Russia why so many of the troops are dying. So then he will try to finish the war as soon as possible. I think India's position, Dr. Dhananjay will be speaking, but I just want to make it clear that, I think we took the right position on abstaining because the kind of dependency that we have on Russia vis-a-vis our defense is unprecedented. 70% we depend on Russia, and the kind of platforms that the Russians are willing to give India, like the S-400s or the nuclear submarines, the West is not willing to give us. And then, of course, we have China on our borders. It's a real threat. It's our principal adversary. And we do not want the building of a China-Pakistan-Russia axis. And if we abandon or if we criticize Russia at this point, I think we also feel, Russia will move away from us towards this China-Pakistan axis. We also feel Russia has been useful for us in blunting Chinese antagonism. I mean, during the Ladakh crisis, the Russians were mediating with the Chinese during the Galwan crisis as well. So again, India's relations with Russia can actually help bridge the differences between Russia and the West, because we'll have some leverage over Russia. And then, of course, we have our own Eurasian ambitions through, INSTC, etc. So we need Russian support. Our priority now clearly is, getting out the students from there. We need, of course, I think this crisis has brought upon us, emphasized the importance for us of self-reliance, and we need to move towards more self-reliance in defense. And if you look at India's explanation of the vote in the United Nations on both occasions, I think it is a very mild criticism of Russia. I mean, we're not completely endorsing what Russia is doing. We have criticized them, but then we have abstained. So I think it's smart policy as far as I'm concerned. Lenin has talked about the Western media coverage. And I think one part that we are all missing out here is kind of racism, the kind of racism that we are seeing in the Western media coverage. I think most of you have seen how the positions have changed from Iraq to what is happening when whites are being killed. They talk about, blonde hair, blue eyes, people like us being killed. So it obviously affects them much more than that of, brown people living in other parts of the world. I'll end with possible scenarios. One is, of course, a very far-fetched scenario, which is that Russia occupies the whole of Ukraine. I think if the Russians have learned anything from Afghanistan, it is that they, that would risk a lot of insurgency. The other is that you have Ukraine divided into two, one along the Dnieper River from Donbass to Odessa, and it would include Mariupol to ensure that Crimea and all get water supply. And this division could either be with Russia annexing the east side of the part that I mentioned, the east side of Ukraine, or declaring them as independent republics like South Ossetia and Abkhazia. The other is there could be regime change, but then even that is fraught with problems because you will need troops to ensure the protection of the regime, particularly because the Ukrainian nationalism is really high, they're going to be hostile. The other is that you could have a power sharing arrangement in Western Ukraine with the East going to Russia and a power sharing arrangement between the Catholics and the Russian Orthodox people in Western, in what is left of Ukraine. But what will happen probably is that Ukraine will remain landlocked. Almost all the ports I think will be captured. And the other scenario I think is Ukraine remains as it is, but it will guarantee its neutrality will be guaranteed. It could become an EU member, but absolutely no possibility of any nuclear weapons on Ukraine soils. And then finally, again, slightly far-fetched, but then I still say it. The last is the possibility of a palace coup in Russia. I think there are a lot of Russians who are very unhappy with what is happening, but then the latest polls also show that 70% of Russians are still supportive of Putin. So I think it's a bit of it's unlikely to happen. So in conclusion, I think this whole crisis has been a story of miscalculations. Zelensky overestimated the support that he would get from the West and how this would intimidate Putin. Putin underestimated the Ukrainian nationalism and the resilience and the fighting capacity. The West underestimated Putin's determination to restore Russian security, and this is basically a classic security dilemma at play. All of you, those of you who do IR, Ukraine wants to be part of NATO for its defense, but Russia sees it as offense against it. And then you have this whole ensuing security dilemma. So I think the West underestimated Putin's determination. And the result of what Putin has done is that he's actually reinvigorated NATO, and he's done the exact opposite of what he wanted to do. So he's ended Swedish and Finnish neutrality. Germany is going to militarize. Japan is now talking about revising the 3 no's nuclear policies. So I think, in hindsight, I think what Putin did was not a great thing. Let's see how this moves forward. I think the next 48 hours are going to be crucial for us to understand what is happening. But of course, some kind of talks are already happening. So hopefully, I think, one thing I keep wondering is, why is it that, all these religious leaders, all these great people with influencers, why are they not even offering good offices or trying to mediate in this crisis? I hope I have not spoken. Oh, I have spoken a lot. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.